let's get some of the basics of Serum out of the way. Now, you can think of Serum as being broken up into 3 distinct main sections. This top section up here, this is where you're going to navigate the various parts of the synth. Think from the oscillator page to the effects page to the mod matrix to your global settings to obviously things like preset browsing and your menu controls like save presets, load presets, that sort of stuff. Now, this top strip here, we're going to cover it in a little bit more in depth in terms of like the menu and the different options a little bit later, but let's move on to the section below that, which is kind of the meat and bones of the synth. And this is the section where you're going to be generating your tone. Okay, we talked about that in the last video. Now, there are 4 different oscillators inside of Serum. There's a sub-oscillator with various waveforms. You have a noise oscillator, which is actually the coolest noise oscillator in any subtractive synth I've ever used, and we're going to talk about that later. And it's a very powerful sound design tool. So don't skip that video for sure. If you're just like, oh, noise oscillator, check that one out. Then you have 2 of main oscillators, oscillator A and oscillator B. Now, both of these oscillators have the exact same controls and exact same settings by default. So once you get really familiar with one oscillator, the other oscillator becomes a piece of cake. Then over to the right, you have your main filter. Now, the main filter, you can load up tons of different filter types, but this is where you're going to be doing that subtractive element of your sound design process for the most part. And that's where you're usually going to be filtering out frequencies from the wavetables. And we talked about that a little bit in the previous video. Now, the third section of the synth down here, this is the section of the synth that brings your static tone that you generate into the real world. So that's where you have things like your envelopes. You have 3 of them. Envelope 1 is tied to the amp output by default. So if I move this, we get an effect. If I go to 2 and do the same thing in 3, we don't, right? So those are for modulation. Now over here you have what you can see is 4 LFOs. Now these LFOs inside of Serum are incredibly powerful. So unlike a lot of LFOs and synths where you just can load up static shapes like a sine, a square, a ramp up, a ramp down, you can freely edit these and create as many points as you want for really interesting LFOs, kind of like gated sequences. You can create arpeggiated sequences as well with these, and we're gonna talk about that later in the video. Now there are actually 8 of them. So if I pop this LFO 4 on a modulation source, you'll see that LFO 5 comes up, and if I drop 5 on another source, 6. It can go up to 8. Now the cool thing is these LFOs can be used essentially as envelopes. So you may only think, well, is 3 envelopes enough? Well, yeah, it is, because you can use up to 8 of the LFOs as envelopes as well. You also have things like velocity control over here to the right. Now, if you're trying to make a sound like a piano or maybe like a Rhodes keyboard, you want it to be velocity sensitive, where if you hit the key soft, it plays soft. You hit it loud, it plays louder. But if you're trying to have like some crazy ass trap lead that's always in your face, you don't need that. Again, this section is where you bring the synth into the real world, how it's going to be listened and consumed. You also have voicing down here, like mono, legato, right? And then below this, you have the keyboard, which you can go up to the menu and you can actually hide the keyboard. You don't actually have to have that visible in the synth, right? All right, so that sums up this quick overview of the various sections of Serum. So now when I'm referring to certain sections or certain things, you should all be on the same page as me moving forward. So in the next video, we're going to talk about the basic waveforms of synthesis, which might seem boring and redundant, but there's some cool stuff in that video, so check it out.